A warm welcome to our English language special edition podcast interview. You are listening to the DigiKompetenz Podcast with Anne Cork and Philip Ramin.
And today we're going to talk to Professor Dr. Michael Dowling, Chair of Innovation and Technology Management in the Faculty of Business, Economics, Information Systems and Real Estate at the University of Regensburg, Chairman of the Board of MÜNCHNER KREIS, and lead singer in the Professor rock band Wise Noise, FC Bayern fan, and an American who I am told was imported to Germany by his wife. Welcome to our podcast, Mike.
Pleasure to be here. He would say that I followed her rather than...
It's a good start. So, Mike, your rock band's called Wise Noise. Is digital competence a lot of wise noise about something that's been in existence for a long time and it just got a different name?
Yeah, I mean, music has been around for a long time and has different names. But over time, we have to adapt to new styles and also take on new things that we can learn. And I think digital competence is pretty much the same. Anytime new technologies come along, you have to learn to be competent with them. And that goes back to the caveman with the wheel and the steam engine, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's just a long line and further things we have to learn how to do.
So, Mike, I have to admit there aren't very many stories about people shooting off cannons that have me amused. But Americans only hitting 1% of their targets, and good old Lieutenant Sims from the US Navy meeting Admiral Percy from the UK Navy in 1900 had me absolutely fascinated. Could you explain to our listeners what happened and why this might be related to digital competency?
Yeah, it's a great story. It's when the British and the Americans were allies as opposed to enemies, which is good. We were fighting with the Spanish at that time. I used that case that I found in a book on organizational change at some point to show you that organizational change, and in this case, competencies and changing as technologies change, have been around for a long time. And in this particular story, Lieutenant Sims is serving as sort of a guest officer on this boat with the British Navy. I believe it was in the Indian Ocean in one version of this, when he he didn't notice, the Admiral, Percy, noticed that a particular gunner was much more effective at hitting a target in target practice than the other gunners. And they literally went up and asked him, well, why are you better at this? And he says, well, I timed my shot with the movement of the ship. And that was what the problem was with shooting cannons off of ships. When the ships are moving, it makes them very inaccurate. I always preface this story with, if you haven't seen it, a great example is the movie Master and Commander starring Russell Crowe, also about the British Navy. It's on Netflix these days. And you can see how close in they had to get in order to fight each other because the cannons were so inaccurate. And they asked this gunner, well, what can we do? Well, anything to help him move the gun faster would make it easier to do what he was doing. So they simply put some pulleys on it and some wheels to make that movement go easier. That's what we in academia call architectural innovation. It's not a radical innovation. It's mainly taking things that exist and reconfiguring them to come up with something new. And the improvement was 3,000%. Then the interesting part of the story is when Lieutenant Sims tries to transfer that innovation back to, we were more honest about it in those days, I think in England as well, it wasn't called the Defense Department, it was called the War Department, because that's what they were into. And they wouldn't accept his innovation. They claimed he was crazy, really. They basically assumed that he was falsifying information. And it has to do with the fact that he was a lieutenant, low-level officer. The people in the War Department are all admirals, the so-called not invented here syndrome. If there really was such an invention, they should have invented it and not somebody else, right? And then there was other things having to do with cultural differences as well. And those sorts of things, can have a hindering effect on any kind of innovation. But I think today with digital innovations, they're particularly important because we often see who comes up with the digital innovation. Some digital native kid somewhere on his iPhone develops some new app, and then it takes over the world by storm. And getting people to adopt those things when they come from outside of their organizations is more important than ever.
So Mike, let's move on from the nutty Navy into the world of the dogs. The title of your chapter involves old analog dogs. So how much can old analog dogs learn new tricks? How much of learning new tricks is involved in digital competency? Or are there old analog dog tricks that new digital dogs can learn?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are things that can go in both directions. And what we try to show, Martin and I, in the chapter is, of course, you can teach an old dog new tricks, but they have to be willing to learn. Mm-hmm. And that is often the problem. But it can actually go both ways. There are some times that the learning ability is not a function of age, but a function of other things that hinders people. I used to do some teaching for the Deutsche Telekom when they moved from being a government agency, like the postal and telecommunication services, to a company. And it was interesting, those people that were shifting to the new company, the ones that were more open to change were not necessarily only the younger ones. It was sometimes the older ones. It was an openness to change that's important, and that's what we try to point out. And it's those there are, and that's where Martin's expertise comes in as a psychologist, to know a lot of the psychological factors that have an impact on people's willingness to change.
Great. So, Mike, it's a well-known secret that you're a fan of FC Bayern, and I'm being very, very careful now, watching my words, trying not to say football and call it soccer, as is politically correct for the Americans. But do you think that the football game or the soccer game can be compared in its skills to the skills needed for mastering digitalization? Let me just give you a buzzword: the libero.
It's interesting, the libero has kind of died out. Today, the modern libero is Manuel Neuer, the goalie, who comes way out of the goal. It almost bit him, was it last week, Philip, I think, where he came out too far, lost the ball, but then the opposing striker hit the post instead of sinking the ball into the net. So yeah, you see changes in that as well over time. There aren't the similar positions, and changes in styles of play. I was reading an article about how Man City, who's now at the top of the Premier League, to go back to your country, how they really adopted the style of play that Pep Guardiola preaches this season, and that's why they're doing so well. Yeah, so in any endeavor, you're going to see changes like that over time. The interesting part to relate to the digital and football is how much teams now are using analytics to analyze their players and their performances, and using that for training purposes, but also for recruiting purposes. Mm-hmm. And it's said that Manchester City is one of the top clubs because they have almost unlimited funding to do that. And apparently Liverpool did that as well last year too. They had a data scientist working for them, analyzing all the players in their training.
So who will be the Deutsche Meister this year, Mike?
It's good. Well, at least it's exciting for a change, right? It's definitely not going to be Dortmund after last night, but it's going to go down, I think, between Bayern and Leipzig.
Most obviously, yeah. Well, let's switch a little bit to Münchner Kreis. Talking a little bit about Corona. What is your experience so far? You're in touch with many companies, big ones, small ones. Can you observe any patterns at the moment? How well are companies dealing with the Corona crisis and the outcome? What is your forecast on that?
Well, obviously, we all had to switch to doing what we're doing right now, a Zoom meeting rather than a physical face-to-face meeting. Mm-hmm. And that created some difficulties initially, but now we've all gotten really used to it. Mm-hmm. And it has great advantages for certain things. It will, I think permanently the amount of travel people are going to be doing is going to be reduced. It will come back, but it'll be a long time before it comes back to what it was, because we don't need to go. I was going to Berlin once a month, and probably 3/4 of those trips were to meet with people I already knew. I didn't need to meet or network with new people, but we were having a meeting. And those are going to disappear. There's no reason for me to spend a day traveling to Berlin to meet with people I already know. And the Münchner Kreis, basically, we are an organization that puts on events and have gone all digital. We'll come back to physical events, but not back to 100% physical. We'll have meetings, committee meetings. The chairmans with my board will meet probably, we have 3 meetings a year. We'll probably do, my prediction, 2 digital and 1 physical, because we do miss the physical interaction. And that needs to come back, and especially the networking and meeting people. So we're all getting better used to that. And I think that's going to come back, but not to what it was, certainly.
That's right, Mike. You're also the chair of innovation and technology at Regensburg University. So how important do you think it is for students to do practical work in companies? And are they learning from the companies, or the companies learning from them? Are they injecting a little bit of Sturm und Drang into the companies themselves and giving them a little bit of foresight by asking the right questions at the wrong time, or the wrong questions at the right time?
Oh, it's very, very important. We encourage our business and business information students to do at least in each phase, bachelor and or master, at least 1 larger internship somewhere. For our honor, we have an honors program for the top 5% of our students. They're required to do such internships, and it's critical in today's world. If you don't have some work experience under your belt, by the time you get into the job market, you're going to have a much more difficult time in the job market. So yeah, I think also it's certainly a two-way street, but it's probably 80% the students learning and the companies learning, 20% from more digital natives and the things that they're interested in, and maybe working styles. But it's mainly for the students to grow, I think.
What do you observe about digital competence when it comes to your students? Is there an obvious increase, or are also students struggling with being digital competent? We were already talking about how is age related to digital competence?
Yeah, for our business students, I mean, with the digital things that they need to do, they come in with a very high competence level. I mean, they're using their computers, they're using their smartphones. They're not having to program, right? They're not having to build sensors into some device from an industry 4.0 point. So for the students, I mean, I've been here 25 years ago, and I remember when I first came here, they were not even using simple tools like PowerPoint. And I was the first professor to use PowerPoint and have a beamer in the classroom, projector, to put my slides on the wall. And that has changed tremendously. Now today, Philip, that students often have better computers than the professors, and they've gotten a lot better at using digital technologies for presentations with videos and everything else. So for our area, it certainly is a high level for what they need. I really can't speak to the engineers or to the business informatics students. You'd have to talk to one of them. My guess is it varies, that some are very high and some are more medium.
And what about digitalization, digital competence, at the institution, universities? Is it a success story so far?
Yes and no. I mean, the great success story is we switched to Zoom lecturing fairly easily. Although there was initial reluctance on the part of, I guess how I should say this diplomatically in case they ever hear about it, some members at the higher levels of the university, let me put it that way. When the Corona first hit, like in March and April, we heard discussions that they were just going to delay the start of the next semester until this all went away. I think they were listening too much to Donald Trump's predictions that it was all going to disappear. And I simply told members of the administration, hey, we have the technology. Zoom is here. We can use something else. But most US universities had implemented Zoom. We're going to do it. We're not even going to ask for permission. We're going to start doing digital teaching. And that's what happened. And luckily enough, then they came along and the rest of the Bavarian, they chose Zoom as the tool, which is preferred by most academic settings. And it worked perfectly fine. I mean, it's not ideal, but I use a lot of case teaching, Harvard case teaching. And it turns out there are some advantages to teaching cases in a Zoom meeting as opposed to face-to-face. You can follow who's saying what, when, and where by when they turn their camera on and shut it off.
Right.
Once you get used to that, it's actually a pretty effective tool for smaller groups. For larger groups, 100 or more, it's boring for the students and boring for the professor. I can't get any feedback back from them because you can't have 100 cameras on at once. They don't laugh at my jokes, so I don't have the immediate response when you do a little stand-up comedy. The class that you and I used to do filled up with 300 people in it is suddenly 200 little tiles over 10 Zoom pages. But it works and people aren't getting sick. Right. At the beginning of this past semester, there was going back and forth between should we go in the classroom or should we not? And I decided no, I was going to stick with Zoom. And we had 10 students from Ireland that made it to Regensburg who would have been in my lecture hall the first day. And 5 of them came down with COVID in the first week.
Wow.
And but they weren't in the classroom exposing any of their colleagues or me. And then this, just the last couple of weeks, we had some troubles because we decided to try and do take-home exams. So exams through different e-learning systems. And there were some problems in implementing them, mainly because we had one system that was working fine, we thought, and our computer people thought it wouldn't be stable enough, and introduced another system that had stability problems. And then 2 of my colleagues decided they were just going to pass out their exams via email and then get the exams back via email, which caused the email server of the university on Thursday to collapse because they put up a terabyte of information within 10 minutes. So those sorts of things we're learning from. But all in all, we've done pretty well, I think. I think it's been, my wife is a school teacher in the vocational high school system here. They've done pretty well too, but they had more struggles with systems that were put up that weren't designed for what they were using them for, e-learning systems and things like that. But the universities have done, for the most part, pretty well, I think.
So Mike, we've spoken a little bit about universities, but you have, as chairman of the board at MÜNCHNER KREIS, a very good insight into business thinking and thinking in society about digitalization. Do you think that their world differs greatly from the world at university where you teach innovation? I mean, do your fingers itch sometimes that you want to say, come and spend a semester at Regensburg?
Well, I interact so much with companies through the MÜNCHNER KREIS, and sometimes we do some consulting projects that I think I have a pretty good sense of what's going on in industry. So I always enjoy I still do some executive teaching of practicing managers that are doing our executive MBA program. And that's always fun to get contact with people that are interacting directly with things. And through the MÜNCHNER KREIS, we have 150 companies that we interact with all the time. So I feel pretty close to that. They sometimes want to come and talk to our students or interact with me, which is always fun.
Mike, one of your research, how should I say it? One of your main research was about disruptive innovation, or the research of the chair. Why is disruptive innovation so popular today? I mean, everyone is using the term, sometimes appropriately, sometimes not so much. Why is there so much hype about disruptive innovation?
Yeah, that's still a problem, that a lot of people use the term incorrectly or not in the way it was invented by Clayton Christensen of the Harvard Business School. Just last week, I listened to a talk from Architect, the German Academy of Engineering, big-time SAP guy, and he had this chart up about disruptive innovation. And what he was talking about was radical innovation.
Right.
And using it synonymously with radical innovation. Radical innovation is always interesting because radical changes have big impacts on companies and industries. Disruptive innovation occurs in the sense that Christensen defined it, occurs in a relatively small percentage of the cases, but when it occurs, established companies have a particularly hard time dealing with it. And that's what makes disruptive innovation so interesting. And that always brings back back to the Lieutenant Sim stories. It wasn't a radical innovation to put pulleys on a cannon, but it was disruptive. And if they hadn't accepted it, they could have run into trouble by the next war that came along. And so that's why it's been such an interesting area to do research on, that my team has done some of the German studies. And Christensen unfortunately passed away last year, he and his team and his consulting firm. And it still always fascinates me. The interesting thing too, and that was something that our group did some work on, was predicting how something might be disruptive. Because Christensen spent most of his time looking back and doing almost historical analyses of how things were disruptive and what effects that had on an industry. The interesting question is, what will be disruptive? We had that one dissertation, you remember, Philip, from another Philip Klenner, trying to predict whether electric cars will be disruptive to the automobile industry. His prediction was no, and I still think he's right. And there'll be Teslas out there, but you're not going to see BMW and Daimler go away anytime soon.
So, Mike, when you go into all this innovation and different types of innovation, what about people like Nokia that didn't dare take over the concept of a smartphone? How much risk do you need to be willing to take to succeed?
Well, Nokia is a great example. It's in our chapter. It wasn't that they didn't dare. The marketing people didn't listen to the research people. The research people developed a touchscreen way before the iPhone, 2 years before the iPhone. And they brought it to the marketing people, and marketing said, well, that looks interesting, but what will it cost? Maybe 700, 800 euros. And the marketing people laughed them out of the room, saying no one will ever pay 800 euros for a smartphone. What did your iPhone cost, Philip, the last one? 1,000 probably?
Around, yes.
Yeah, the new one cost about 1,000, right? So that's often the case, is where companies fail. It's not because they didn't have the far-sighted people. It's because other people blocked them. And you see examples of that all the time. Siemens had a smartphone very similar to the iPhone, and I've seen it actually, the model that they use, but it was clunky. It wasn't designed very well. The touchscreen wasn't as good. I mean, Steve Jobs was brilliant, rarely developing his own technologies. They spent typically 2 to 3% of their sales on R&D, which is low for a high-tech company, but they were brilliant in taking technologies and packaging it with a design that made people want to have it.
So what do you think, what kind of competences are important in order to deal with disruptive innovation? Today we hear a lot about disruptive thinking, so another buzzword. What is it about? How could you describe disruptive thinking?
Yeah, I think it has to be an openness to kind of think out of the box. That's where the people who get into danger with disruptive innovation is when they do what we teach them to do in business schools, which is listen to your best customers and serve them well. And what Christensen proved was that's fine for what he called sustaining innovation, which could be incremental or radical, but innovations that help you serve your current customers to do what they're already doing better. And if you do that, that's fine. But if some disruption comes along, it's getting those people to think out of the box and deal with something that their current customers might not want. And it's often individuals that get blocked. I once met and talked to one of the top guys at BMW Research. They had a hybrid car 2 years before the Toyota Prius, and they were blocked because the BMW management said, oh, it won't be Freude am Fahren, which is their buzzword, right? It won't give the same driving sense, a hybrid car. No, we're not going to make it. And now look at the catch-up. That was probably 10, 15 years ago. They're catching up now, though. That's the other lesson is, if you lose out to a disruptive innovation, that doesn't mean you're dead, but it often depends on the technology and how quickly the technology cycles are. So by the time Nokia recovered, it was too late. But Microsoft has always been a company that responds relatively late, but has so much money that they could push in and reestablish themselves. IBM is similar. So it depends on the technology, but the disruptive thinking means, be willing to think outside the box, as we would say, and perhaps think about who could be our customers of tomorrow that are not our customers today.
Some people have mindset blocks, Mike, regarding this kind of thinking. Is there any way to get them to move these mindset blocks and start trying out things so that they can cope with continual progress?
Yeah, Martin in our article talks a lot about that, because that's where you really start to get into the psychology of people. And I think that that can be done. And it also is going to depend on the person, him or herself, and how open they are to those things. But training programs can do that. Education programs, sending somebody back to school, can help break people out of their mindsets. Job rotation can help break them out of their mindsets. There are a number of methodologies that we know, and it's going to depend on the person. And in some cases, maybe not. Then maybe you need to find new people and bring in new people.
Is mindset something cultural? Is there a difference between American and German mindset as far as innovation and disruptive thinking's involved?
There are some tendencies. I mean, we know, going back to the famous studies of Hofstede, that there are different cultural dimensions by different countries. And there's something that's done globally called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor that every year measures that. So yeah, on average, we know that, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley are more risk-seeking than probably the average entrepreneur in Germany. But the averages aren't what matter. We know that there are plenty of risk-seeking entrepreneurs that do well here. And their companies, as soon as they start getting a little bit bigger, one of my good friends, a guy named Thomas Alt in Munich, started a great augmented reality company, grew it from 0 to 250 employees, and Apple bought the whole thing and moved them all to Cupertino, California. And there's a lot more of them than we think. So I think there's an overemphasis on, the Germans are too risk averse. That's why they're poor entrepreneurs. I don't see that. And we in the Münchner Kreis see more and more successful entrepreneurs, male and female. There are some structural things that hinder entrepreneurship, some things dealing with venture capital financing and things like that. But that's even changed. Today, there's more money seeking good ideas. So I don't think there's a problem with that. And people often, will pick outliers to compare. Well, why isn't Munich more like Silicon Valley? Nobody is like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a once-in-a-planet constellation of government money, of universities, of culture, of also good weather, of all sorts of things that made that place unique. And attempts to copy it in the United States have not been successful either. What they've done is adapted it. So Austin, Texas is different than Boston. Right. And we see that here in Germany now too, where you have, I think Munich is really very successful IT and biotech cluster. Even Regensburg has done well with its smaller biotech and its smaller IT cluster. So yeah, there are some cultural differences. In my view, those are often overemphasized. We're more alike than we are different.
But what do you think, is there still some specific blogger on innovation and digitalization here in Germany, why we're still struggling sometimes with, being fast and making things happen?
For some people, yes. But when I see the companies that we have involved in Münchner Kreis coming up with stuff, and when I see Unternehmertum as the Technical University of Munich's startup facility, we just had them the other night at one of our events, and all the stuff they're doing. I really don't think that's that important. I think there are some people that are reluctant to adopt new technologies, but I think that's not a hindering factor anymore.
So more self-confidence, more optimism?
Yeah, I think that, the right people are finding those things. What we have to do is identify them and then hopefully give them the tools. That's something that we do for business students, is to teach them how to do a business plan. So that they maybe even think about, hey, there is another life besides going to work for Siemens. And maybe not as soon as they get out of school, but maybe a couple of years later. And we're seeing that too. The more we know also from research, for example, big studies at MIT showed the most successful entrepreneurs started their companies on average of 5 years after leaving MIT.
Wow.
So it's not trying to turn students into entrepreneurs, but creating a sensibility for those things and maybe giving them tools to start something up later.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, Mike, when people start things up, that they've got a good product and it's going well, that their fear of cannibalization holds them back on being successful?
That has been empirically proven, that one of the problems with disruptive innovation, it typically cannibalizes something the companies are already doing. So they tend to double down and reinvest more in the things that they already know well. For example, Nokia with the touchscreen, Nokia at the time, their core competence was making cheap cell phones with not a lot of functionality in them, but they sold them to mass markets around the world. And they kept trying to do that better. But at the end of the day, they couldn't compete with the Chinese on that. And that's probably what ultimately drove them out of the mobile phone market, because they couldn't go upscale because they missed the boat on smartphones, and they were no longer competitive downscale. So yeah, there are that cannibalization effect is still there. And one of the things we've learned with disruptive innovation, in particular, or innovation in general, is you need to develop capabilities sometimes in parallel to each other. Mm-hmm. So you have your core old technology that's still being developed, and maybe you have a new unit or a new group, a digital group. A lot of the German companies have set up these labs in Berlin to push the digital parts of their companies, which is Christensen's research suggested is a good thing to do. Get them separate so they can develop their own culture, develop their own customers away from the center. But that's nothing new. IBM developed the first PC in 1981 by taking a group of engineers from New York and moving them to Florida, because they were not able to develop it within the IBM umbrella because it kept getting squashed. Then they moved them physically to Boca Raton, Florida, with a charge to develop a PC within 1 year, and they did it.
Sometimes people also say, well, actually, you don't need to do everything on your own. You need to build up an ecosystem. In such an ecosystem, maybe it's also a good idea to think about co-petition. Could you briefly explain this co-petition idea?
Co-petition is the word sticking competition and cooperation together. Mm-hmm. And the word was actually coined by the head of Novell Networks, a guy named Ray Norda. Mm-hmm. That he developed the term back in the early 1990s. And I guess, somewhat proud. I think I wrote with colleagues, the first academic article where the word co-opetition is mentioned. We took it from this guy who had developed it in the computer business. And it just was very common in the computer world in the 80s and 90s to cooperate with your competitors. Mm-hmm. So Apple and Microsoft were competitors, but cooperated on certain things. Mm-hmm. And we began to find examples of this all over the place, and did research over the years, and now it's become a big area of research. And it's particularly true in ecosystem development. I had one of my first doctoral students who studied the growth of the biotech startup area, Martensried by Munich. And these were companies that were starting up that were competing against each other, but they would share knowledge at the same time. They would sometimes, if one guy ran out of some reagent he needed, would go borrow it from his competitor down the street or in the next building. And they helped each other all move up, even though in many times they were competing with each other. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that in lots and lots of industries today. And thank goodness in industries, with COVID. BioNTech and Pfizer are an example, in a sense, of co-opetition. Pfizer is a pharmaceutical company that could have tried to develop its own vaccine, but couldn't or didn't. And BioNTech certainly didn't have the production capabilities to make en masse. There's a great talk that just came out last week about this. In fact, BioNTech was developing vaccines for a size of one. They're developing vaccines for an individual cancer patient, not for the mass produced type. And it was only by chance that they were able to come up with this COVID vaccine, and there was no way they could make it to scale. So they cooperate with a much bigger competitor. And now just recently, Joe Biden announced that Merck that had a vaccine that failed. So they tried to bring this is the American Merck, not the German Merck. They had a vaccine that failed, and now they're going to make Johnson & Johnson's vaccine in cooperation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's something that's happening more and more. It doesn't always work, but and sometimes companies will find themselves in this kind of relationship and then get back out of it over time. But in many instances, it can be beneficial to both parties.
Mm-hmm.
So Mike, we've spoken a lot about companies. Let's go back to the people in the companies that have to learn digital competence. If somebody employs a digital native, does that mean I've got somebody who doesn't need to learn anything new? They can do it all and it all comes naturally?
No, of course not. I mean, the digital natives are people that can use these technologies more seamlessly than older folks, but the application is important. What does it help me to be able to use the apps on my iPhone if I can't use then the app that a company is developing to work on my iPhone and know how that works? So digital natives alone won't help anybody, but it has to be the combination of the two.
Do you think that the German universities need to become more practical oriented, similar to the universities of applied sciences, or should it be two different tracks?
I actually think that the two different tracks, it's co-opetition. They complement each other well. And I think that the traditional focus of the German universities on research and the University of Applied Sciences on application of that research have served us well. And I actually don't think it makes a lot of sense to break those boundaries down. So, for example, I just have finished the first doctoral student that I did jointly with the Regensburg OTH, the University of Applied Sciences here. Perfect example of cooperation. But to then all of a sudden say, well, they should all be doing research too, which is what the Brits did, right? You turned all your polytechs into research universities. I mean, that would be the other way to go. But if you're not careful, if the resources don't grow tremendously, if you take the same amount of resources and say, okay, now everybody's doing research, what that means is that the research universities are going to decline and the polytechs or the applied universities will go up some, but the overall level will be less. So that would be a big danger.
I think it was Google who said that they had to bring in people from all different disciplines to actually have innovation within a team. Do you think that's the case?
Depends on the innovation, depends on the technology. That can be very useful. There are some very good design firms that use interdisciplinary teams with anthropologists and psychologists and everything in them. So yeah, it can be. But if I have to, work on some technical part of a BMW or the technical part of a Cronus machine, then an anthropologist isn't going to do me much good, right? I need a traditional mechanical engineer. So you can't really say that in general. But for a lot of things, particularly consumer-oriented innovations, having interdisciplinary teams can be very useful, clearly.
There's a German word, Mike, Abschluss, that you get when we get your degree, that would imply you're finished learning. Is that the case?
Boy, if anybody thinks that today, then they're really misinformed. Nobody finishes learning ever. The Abschluss is only a certificate for your formal education, but the people who are going to do well are going to continue finding ways to learn all the time. I mean, I hope that I've done that. I haven't gotten any further degrees along the way, but certainly I've learned a lot from all the students that I interact with and the companies that I interact with. And yeah, in today's world, I think, probably 20, 30 years ago, maybe that was the case in certain industries. Everything you needed to know, you finished with your diplom Kaufmann or your diplom engineer and could work in industry and have your career and that'd be it. But there wouldn't be many industries today that I would know that be the case.
I'd really like to know, Mike, because my daughter said to me, she wished for at Christmas, she wished for YouTube. All I want for Christmas is YouTube, Mum, she said.
You already have YouTube?
She didn't know that she had it, no. And I'd like to know, how do you feel about Professor Dr. YouTube? Just
YouTube in general, or?
Yeah, as a learning tool.
I think it can be great for certain things. Putting stuff up that people can look at and learn by. And I use it myself when I have trouble with something. And the first thing you do is search and find a YouTube video that helps you. And there are these massively online courses, MOOC, that use YouTube as a platform for basically transmitting knowledge. It can be very, very useful. On the other hand, it doesn't provide much context, and it doesn't provide any interaction. And in my particular field, I would say, and Philip, you would know this better than me, probably 40, 50% of what we learn is through interacting and discussion. And that, you don't have on YouTube.
So you are not assuming a disruption of the universities or the
some. I mean, there has been some of that. The great story is the one with Sebastian Thrun from Stanford, the German computer science guy that put up the first MOOC course expecting 500 students and got something like 150,000 students. And he still teaches that using those tools. So there is some disruption, I think, especially when it comes to basic kind of information, putting information out there. But what you don't have is the interaction effect and the learning that goes on in small groups discussing a case study and working out a solution to a case study. And so to that extent, I don't think will be disrupted out of existence. And it's some of the initial projections about these massive online courses have not panned out. The dropout rates are very high, hard to keep people going with them and things like that. So I'm confident I'll make it to retirement, and I think whoever follows me will make it to retirement too. But we'll use the tools we already are. I mean, we put more stuff up online, and it can be very useful to people. So give your daughter YouTube would be my recommendation. But watch what she watches.
I've already done it.
You have to be careful because there's still a lot of stuff out there, and YouTube has gotten better. And there's the whole discussion of the political thing with the political propaganda that was up on Facebook and YouTube. So you have to be careful about especially what kids are watching.
Well, I'll tell her when she's 18 that I didn't have to buy it.
That's right. That make her work harder for it now.
The best joke going. But Mike, does there come a point where you wake up one day and you can say, now I'm digitally competent?
No, because digital stuff keeps advancing, right? I roughly know what a quantum computer is, but quantum computers are probably going to be here in 5 years. Do I need to learn how to program one? I doubt it, but maybe I need to know somebody who knows how to program one. And I certainly need to worry about whether my credit cards are safe, because technically if somebody has a quantum computer, they can break all internet security protocols that we currently have.
Right.
So no, we'll never stop. You never reach a point where we say, now I've done it. I mean, I think that for my, on a day-to-day existence, I'm probably digitally competent enough for what I do on a day-to-day business, but there's always going to be new fun things to learn.
How will AI influence the education landscape?
That's a good one. The University of Regensburg is starting a whole new faculty with a bunch of these AI professorships that the Bavarian government is funding. I think it'll have an impact. I don't think it will. I don't think we'll have robotic professors coming in anytime real soon that can then respond to students and interact with them, despite what movies are showing these days. But using AI techniques to do analysis of stuff. Because what is fundamentally artificial intelligence is using algorithms to sort through data and recognize patterns in a better way. So we'll be able to use that in lots more ways to analyze data better. So I think that will open up new avenues.
Mike, the world-renowned psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl, he said that the ultimate freedom of mankind is the ability to choose how to face a situation. How should we be choosing to face the situation of innovation approaching us at full speed?
With a curious mind and openness, and not the initial reluctance to say no. To at least be open to things, to test things, try them out. It's the other thing that we learned, that innovation, the most innovative companies and people are willing to try something out and to fail at it. So companies have to be willing to let their employees fail. And so we have to have that openness and willingness to try. If you don't have that, you won't be successful as a person. And if you don't have that as in a group, you won't be successful as a company either.
That's a perfect bridge to our almost last question, Mike. Something like an outlook on digital competence. If you think in the future, what will be in particular important when it comes to developing digital competence? Maybe on an individual level, on an economic level, on a business level, you can choose something. So some kind of forecast.
Well, I think what the Münchner Kreis has been looking at this, and I know you guys at E4.0 have been looking at this, and Martin in particular. I think what's going to be very interesting is how we define what does digital competence mean at a micro level. Does digital competence mean I need to have to use my smartphone? And to the other extreme, does it mean I need to know how to program a quantum computer?
Right.
And the answer is yes, everything in between, and it depends on the job, right? So for some jobs, it's going to be fine to know how to use your smartphone. And for other jobs, you're going to have people with much more advanced competencies. And the challenge is for companies to develop that portfolio of competencies that are right for their different businesses, and also find the right people to put in those slots. We had a talk, I don't remember whether you were at that talk one time at a board meeting of the Münchner Kreis, where we had the chief digital officer of the Bavarian radio network, Bayerischer Rundfunk, talked how they develop digital competence in their organization. And it was a great story. What they did is they found not so much digital natives, but digital open people in different parts of the organization, identified them, and then started giving them the resources to digitalize the groups that they were in. They kind of, going back to the old, a very old organization theory model, the promoter model of my mentor and the founder of the Münchner Kreis, Eberhard Winter, they found digital promoters. And they were not necessarily high up in the hierarchy, but they were either young people or older people that were open to that, identified them, gave them resources, and allowed them to experiment and do things, and move the whole organization much further and faster than some of their competing organizations. And that's the challenge, I think, is how we find those people and train them.
So, Mike, a very difficult question now. Are there absolute no-goes regarding digital competence and building up digital competence, things that you just shouldn't do?
No-goes. Well, I guess the big one that's talked about the most is what the Chinese are doing, right? They're developing digital competencies to keep track of all of their people on a daily basis. We in the West are horrified by this because we think it's such, an infringement on our freedoms. Surveys of Chinese people, they don't find it so bad because they have a different culture that sees this kind of a fatherly or motherly control of their lives to be a good thing. I don't want to live in that society. And so, that to me is still an area that we have to be very careful here in the Western world about impinging on people's privacy and freedom in that sense. I don't really want Google knowing exactly where I am all of the time. But I do like Google Maps to keep track of where I'm driving if that helps their Google Maps function be better, which is what they do, right? They let everybody who uses Google Maps, helps them improve their ability to predict where their traffic jams are going to be and things like that. But that should also be a choice. So, you should continue to allow people to make those choices, to first educate them about what the choices are, and then be able to turn things off if they don't want them. I personally don't want, which is now doable, that I walk into a store and based on my buying habits, the store pushes advertisements to my smartphone because it knows from Amazon what I bought the last 20 days. That's a little bit too much for me personally. Other people might think, hey, if I get a good deal, who cares?
Might have something to do with you being a disruptive thinker, Mike, that you want to buy something else.
Yeah, going to be kind of an individual thing, but I think we also have to be careful then that we always have the ability for people to control their preferences so that they can turn those things off. And that's going to be the main thing in the future.
Well, and at the end, it's always a balance between the different options.
Right.
All right. Well, Mike, thanks a lot for joining us here in our webcast. It was quite a pleasure. So thank you so much. And for our listeners, you can, of course, read some more about this topic in the chapter that Mike has written together with another Dowling in the German language manual for Digital Competence Development. And Mike's chapter is also available as a single chapter online in the next few weeks.
So that was our conversation with Professor Dr. Michael Dowling, Chair of Innovation and Technology Management at Regensburg University and Chairman of the Board at MÜNCHNER KREIS. We learned today that we have to be thankful to Mike's wife for importing innovation to Regensburg University. If you, dear listeners, have a suggestion for an interesting personality just like Mike in the area of digital competence, then please send us an email to podcast@i40.de. With our hashtag DigiKompetenz Podcast, you can follow what's happening in our podcast. And Philip and I would be delighted if you join us again when we say Be Digitally Competent with Philip Ramin and Anne Kowak.
Thank you.